This is Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. Part 1, Chapter 9. For the first time in 3 nights, Okonkwo slept. He woke up once in the middle of the night, and his mind went back to the past 3 days without making him feel uneasy. He began to wonder why he felt uneasy at all. It was like a man wandering in broad daylight, why a dream had appeared so terrible to him at night. He stretched himself and scratched his thigh where a mosquito had bitten him as he slept. Another one was wailing near his right ear. He slapped the ear and hoped it had killed it. Why do they always go for one's ears? When he was a child, his mother told him a story about it. But it was silly, as all women's stories. Mosquito, she had said, had asked Ear to marry him, whereupon Ear fell on the floor in uncontrollable laughter. "How much longer do you think you'll live?" she asked. "You are already a skeleton." Mosquito went away humiliated, and any time he passed her way, he told Ear that he was still alive. Okonkwo turned on his side and went back to sleep. He was roused in the morning by someone banging on his door. "Who is that?" he growled. He knew it must be Ikwifi, one of his 3 wives. Ikwifi was the only one who would have had the audacity to bang on his door. "Nzima is dying," came her voice, and all the tragedy and sorrow of her life were packed in those words. Okonkwo sprang from his bed, pushed back the bolt on his door, and ran into Ikwifi's hut. Nzima lay shivering on a mat beside a huge fire that her mother had kept burning all night. "It is Iba," said Okonkwo, as he took his machete and went into the bush to collect the leaves and grasses and barks of trees that went into making the medicine for Iba. Ikwifi knelt beside the sick child, occasionally feeling her palm, the wet, burning forehead. Nzima was an only child in the center of her mother's world. Very often it was Nzima who decided what food her mother should prepare. Ikwifi even gave her such delicacies as eggs, which children were rarely allowed to eat because such food tempted them to steal. One day, as Nzima was eating an egg, Okonkwo had come in unexpectedly from his hut. He was greatly shocked and swore to beat Ikwifi if she dared to give the child eggs again. But it was impossible to refuse Nzima anything. After her father's rebuke, she developed an even keener appetite for eggs, and she enjoyed above all the secrecy in which she ate them. Her mother always took her into the bedroom and shut the door. Nzima did not call her mother Inye like all children. She called her by her name, Ikwifi, as her father and other grown-up people did. The relationship between them was not only that of a mother and child. There is something in that like companionship of equals, which was strengthened by such conspiracies as eating eggs in the bedroom. Ikwifi had suffered a good deal in her life. She had borne 10 children, and 9 of them died in infancy, usually before the age of 3. As she buried her one child after another, her sorrow gave way to despair, and then grim to resignation. The birth of her children, which should be a woman's crowning glory, became for Ikwifi mere physical agony devoid of promise. The naming ceremony after 7 market weeks became an empty ritual. Her deepening despair found expression in the name she gave her children. One of them was a pathetic cry. "On Wompiko, death, I implore you," but death took no notice. Wompiko died in his 15th month. The next child was a girl, Ozimina. May it not happen again. She died in the 11th month, and 2 others after her. Ikwifi then became defiant and called her next child Onmuma. Death may please himself. And he did. After the death of Ikwifi's 2nd child, Okonkwo had gone to a medicine man, who was also a diviner of the Afa oracle, to inquire what was amiss. This man told him that the child was an Ogbanye, one of those wicked children who, when they died, entered their mother's womb to be born again. When your wife becomes pregnant again, he said, let her not sleep in her hut. Let her go and stay with her people. In that way she will elude her wicked tormentor and break its evil cycle of birth and death. Ikwifi did as she was asked. Soon as she became pregnant, she went to live with her old mother in another village. It was there that her third child was born and circumcised on the 8th day. She did not return to Okonkwo's compound until 3 days before the naming ceremony. The child's name was called Onwumpiko. Onwumpiko was not given proper burial when he died. Okonkwo had called in another medicine man who was famous in the clan for his great knowledge about Ogbanye children. His name was Ogangbu Unyanwa. Ogangbu was a very striking figure, tall, with a full beard and a bald head. He was light in complexion, and his eyes were red and fiery. He always gnashed his teeth as he listened to those who came to consult him. He asked Okonkwo a few questions about the dead child. All the neighbors and relations who had come to mourn gathered round them. On what market day was it born? He asked. Oye, replied Okonkwo. And it died this morning? Okonkwo said yes, and only then realized for the first time that the children had died on the same market day as it had been born. The neighbors and relations also saw the coincidence and said among themselves that it was very significant. Where do you sleep with your wife? In your obi, or in her own hut? Asked the medicine man. In her hut. In future, call her into your obi. The medicine man then ordered that there should be no mourning for the dead child. He brought out a sharp razor from the goatskin bag slung from his left shoulder and began to mutilate the child. Then he took it away to bury in the evil forest, holding it by its ankle and dragging it on the ground behind him. After such treatment, it would think twice before coming again, unless it was one of the stubborn ones who returned, carrying the stamp of their mutilation, a missing finger, or perhaps a dark line where the medicine man's razor had cut them. By the time Onwumpiko died, Ikwifi had become a very bitter woman. Her husband's first wife had already had 3 sons, all strong and healthy. When she had borne her third in succession, Okonkwo had slaughtered a goat for her, as was the custom. Ikwifi had nothing but good wishes for her, but she had grown so bitter that she could not rejoice with others over their good fortune. And so on, the day that Inoye's mother celebrated the birth of her 3 sons with feasting and music, Ikwifi was the only person in the happy company who went about with a cloud on her brow. Her husband's wife took this for malevolence, as husbands' wives were wont to. How could she know that Ikwifi's bitterness did not flow outwards to others, but inwards into her own soul? That she did not blame others for their good fortune, but her own evil chi, who denied her any. At last Nzima was born, and although ailing, she seemed determined to live. At first Ikwifi accepted her, but she had accepted others, with listless resignation. But when she lived on to her 4th, 5th, and 6th years, love returned once more to her mother, and with love anxiety. She determined to nurse her child to health, and she put all her being into it. She was rewarded by occasional spells of health, during which Nzima bubbled with energy like fresh palm wine. At such times she seemed beyond danger, but all of a sudden she would go down again. Everybody knew she was an Obiganye. The sudden bouts of sickness and health were typical of her kind, but she had lived so long that perhaps she had decided to stay. Some of them did become tired of their evil rounds of birth and death, or took pity on their mothers and stayed. Ikwifi believed deep inside that her Nzima had come to stay. She believed because it was the faith alone that gave her own life any kind of meaning. And this faith had been strengthened when the year or so ago, a medicine man had dug up Nzima's Iroya. Everyone knew she would live because her bond with the world of Obaganye had been broken. Ikwifi was reassured, but such was her anxiety for her daughter that she could not rid herself completely of her fear. And although she believed that Iyawa, which had been dug up, was genuine, she could not ignore the fact that some really evil children sometimes misled people into digging up a suspicious one. But Nzima's Iroya had looked real enough. It was a smooth pebble wrapped in a dirty rag. The man who dug it up was the same Ogabu, who was famous in the clan for all his knowledge in these matters. Nzima had not wanted to cooperate with him at first, but that was only to be expected. No Obaganye would yield her secrets easily, and most of them never did because they died too young, before they could be asked questions. Where did you bury your Iriya? Iri or Iwi Una? Okabu had asked Nzima. She was 9 then and was just recovering from a serious illness. What is Iriuna? She asked in return. You know what it is. You buried it in the ground somewhere so that you can die and return it again to torment your mother. Nzima looked at her mother, whose eyes, sad and pleading, were fixed on her. Answer the question at once, roared Okonkwo, who stood beside her. All the family were there and some of the neighbors too. Leave her to me, the medicine man told Okonkwo in a cool, confident voice. He turned again to Nzima. Where did you bury your Iruna? Where they bury children, she replied, and the quiet spectators murmured to themselves. Come along then and show me the spot, said the medicine man. The crowd set out with Nzima leading the way, and Akagbu following closely behind her. Okonkwo came next, and Ikwifi followed him. When she came to the main road, Nzima turned left, as if she was going to the stream. But did you say it was where they bury children? asked the medicine man. No, said Nzima, whose feeling of importance was manifest in her sprightly walk. She sometimes broke into a run and stopped again suddenly. The crowd followed her silently. Women and children returning from the stream with pots of water on their heads wondered what was happening until they saw Okabu and guessed that it must have been something to do with Obaganye. And they knew Ikwifi and her daughter very well. When she got into the big Udula tree, Nzima turned left into the bush, and the crowd followed her. Because of her size, she made her way through the trees and creepers more quickly than her followers. The bush was alive, and with tread feet on dry leaves and sticks, and the moving aside of tree branches, Nzima went deeper and deeper, and the crowd went with her. And she suddenly turned around and began to walk back onto the road. Everybody stood to let her pass, and then filed after her. If you bring us all this way for nothing, I shall beat sense into you, Okonkwo threatened. I have told you to let her alone. I know how to deal with them, said Okabu. Nzima led the way back to the road, looked left and right, and turned right, and so they arrived home again. Where did you bury your Iriuna? asked Okagbu, when Nzima finally stopped outside her father's obi. Okagbu's voice was unchanged. It was quiet and confident. It is near that orange tree, Nzima said. And why did you not say so, you wicked daughter of Akalogi? Okonkwo swore furiously. The medicine man ignored him. Come and show me the exact spot, he said quietly to Nzima. It is here, she said when they got to the tree. Point at the spot with your finger, said Okagbu. It is here, said Nzima, touching the ground with her finger. Okonkwo stood by, rumbling like thunder in the rainy season. Bring me a hoe, said Okagbu. When Ikwifi brought the hoe, he had already put aside his goatskin bag and his bag cloth, and his big cloth, and was in his underwear. A long and thin strip of cloth wound round the waist like a belt, and then passed between the legs to fasten to the belt behind. He immediately set to work digging a pit where Nzima had indicated. The neighbors sat around, watching the pit become deeper and deeper. The dark topsoil soon gave way to the bright red earth with which women scrubbed the floors and walls of the huts. Akagbu worked tirelessly in the silence, his back shining with perspiration. Okonkwo stood by the pit. He asked Akagbu to come up and rest while he took a hand, but Akagbu said he was not tired yet. Akwifi went into her hut to cook yams. Her husband had brought out more yams than usual, because the medicine man had to feed. Nzima went with her and helped in preparing the vegetables. "There is too much green vegetable," she said. "You don't see the pot is full of yams?" Akwifi asked. "And you know how leaves become smaller after cooking." "Yes," said Nzima. "That was why the snake lizard killed his mother." "Very true," said Akwifi. "He gave his mother 7 baskets of vegetables to cook, and in the end there were only 3, and so he killed her," said Nzima. "That is not the end of the story." "Oh," said Nzima, "I remember now. He brought in other 7 baskets and cooked them himself, and there were again only 3, so he killed himself too." Outside the obi, Akagbu and Okonkwo were digging the pit to find where Nzima had buried her Inuuna. Neighbors sat around watching. The pit was now so deep that they no longer saw the digger. They only saw the red earth he threw up, mounting higher and higher. Okonkwo's son, Noye, stood near the edge of the pit because he was wanting to take in all that happened. Akagbu had again taken over the digging from Okonkwo. He worked, as usual, in silence. The neighbors and Okonkwo's wives were now talking. The children had lost interest and were now playing. Suddenly Akagbu sprang to the surface with the agility of a leopard. "It is very near now," he said. "I have felt it." There was immediate excitement, and those who were sitting jumped to their feet. "Call your wife and child," he said to Okonkwo. But Akwifi and Nzima had heard the noise and run out to see what it was. Akagbu went back into the pit, which was now surrounded by spectators. After a few more hoefuls of earth, he struck the Iwuna. He raised it carefully with the hoe and threw it to the surface. Some women ran away in fear when it was thrown, but they soon returned to everyone was gazing at the rag from a reasonable distance. Akagbu emerged, and without saying a word, or even looking at the spectators, he went to his goatskin bag, took out 2 leaves, and began to chew them. When he swallowed them, he took up the rag with his left hand and began to untie it. And then the smooth, shiny pebble fell out. He picked it up. "Is this yours?" he asked Nzima. "Yes," she replied. All the women shouted with joy, because Akwifi's troubles were now at last ended. All of this had happened more than a year ago, and Nzima had not been ill since. And then suddenly she began to shiver in the night. Akwifi brought her to the fireplace, spread her mat on the floor, and built a fire. But she had got worse and worse, and she knelt by her, feeling with her palm the wet, burning forehead. She prayed 1,000 times. Although her husband's wives were saying that it was nothing more than Iba, she did not hear them. Okonkwo returned from the bush, carrying on his left shoulder a large bundle of grasses and leaves, roots and barks of medicinal trees and shrubs. He went into Akwifi's hut, put down his load, and sat down. Get me a pot," he said, "and leave the children alone." Akwifi went to bring the pot, and Okonkwo selected the best from his bundle, in their due proportions, and cut them up. He put them in a pot, and Akwifi poured in some water. "Is that enough?" she asked when she had poured in about half the water into the bowl. "A little more," I said, "a little. Are you deaf?" Okonkwo roared at her. She set the pot on the fire, and Okonkwo took up his machete to return to his obi. "You must watch the pot carefully," he said as he went, "and don't allow it to boil over. If it does, the power will be gone." He went away to his hut, and Akwifi began to tend to the medicine pot, almost as if it was itself a sick child. Her eyes went constantly from Nzima to the boiling pot and back to Nzima. Okonkwo returned when he felt the medicine had cooked long enough. He looked it over and said it was done. "Bring me a low stool for Nzima," he said, "and a thick mat." He took down the pot from the fire and placed it in front of the stool. Then he roused Nzima and placed her on the stool, astride from the steaming pot. The thick mat was thrown over both. Nzima struggled to escape from the choking and overpowering steam, but she was held down. She started to cry. When the mat was last removed, she was drenched in perspiration. Ikwifi mopped her with a piece of cloth and lay down a dry mat and was soon asleep.